Greetings, my friends. Brother Joey here once again for another Signs of the Times report. And in this report, I want to do an Asia-Pacific update. We're going to talk about the whole North Korean situation that is apparently spiraling out of control very, very quickly in an already tense region. You know, I talk about the Asia-Pacific a lot, specifically down in the East and South China Seas. We're going to talk about what's going on down there as well, as a lot of it is tied together, as we'll see, and certainly more signs of the times as the Word of God continues to unfold and the signs continue to unfold here. The wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24. And so I'm going to link you up as usual with everything I showed you. I got, upwards of 20 relevant articles here that we're going to go through very quickly. And of course, I'll link you up to them in the description box below. So we'll start with this one. It's talking about how Washington and Tokyo are deliberately portraying Beijing as an enemy to strengthen their security alliance, according to China's ambassador to Japan and the statements that he released. And he expressed dissatisfaction with their Cold War mindset, as he called it, and their latest attempts to contain China's regional ambitions. And the ambassador, Chung Yonghua, said Friday, well, a couple weeks ago now, in Beijing, and he said, it sounds as if Japan and the United States are purposely taking China as their enemy and saying, let's join hands and go at China. So we're seeing more of this rhetoric, if you will. And, you know, just recently it was reported that China is dramatically increasing their military capabilities, and this comes off of a major overhaul that just happened last year that I did a video on, and it's happening again. And so we'll look at that here in this next piece, in which the headline reads, China next U.S. threat, as Beijing beefs up military to protect trade. And in the piece, it talks about here, it says, China is dramatically altering its military operations, creating specialized teams that can protect its maritime resources, routes, and territorial expansion plans. China will boost its Marine Corps fivefold from 20,000 to 100,000 soldiers, basing them in part at ports in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, in and Gwadar in southwest Pakistan. Now, where they're stationed in Africa, I'll link you up to a piece that talks about they're stationed basically right near a massive U.S. base. And it's interesting with everything going on between the two nations as tensions continue to rise here between these major world powers. And so it goes on to say here that while they reduced the landlocked People's Liberation Army by 300,000 soldiers, they did all these other expansions, and including, it says here, the military buildup will also increase its navy as much as 15% from its current 235,000 personnel and add military bases that house multiple aircraft carrier battle groups, more nuclear-powered attack submarines, destroyers, and more sea-based missile defense platforms, according to experts. And China is boosting its military capabilities, troop numbers, and design, and its reach to defend its maritime rights, to protect its assets in the China Seas, and that's what we talk about a lot, the East and South China Seas specifically. And as one Chinese military expert said, in case of war with Taiwan. And Taiwan, we'll talk briefly about that whole situation a little bit later in the video here as we move along. But in another piece here, it talks about that besides its original missions of a possible war with Taiwan, maritime defense in the East and South China Seas, it's also foreseeable that the PLA Navy's mission will expand overseas, including protection of China's national security in the Korean Peninsula. So you see, they mention specific areas with Taiwan. They mention the East and South China Seas. Of course, we know what's going on down there involving the U.S. We'll talk a lot more about that area as we move along here, of course. But they're also focusing on the Korean Peninsula with everything going on there. And of course, again, we're going to talk a lot more about that too as we move along. Meanwhile, Marine forces from Japan as well as the United States are conducting large joint military exercises down in the East China Sea amid an escalation of tensions in the region, as we've seen recently. And it goes on to say that Japan's Sankei Shimbun newspaper and Kyoto News Agency reported on Friday that the two sides launched the military drills earlier this week. The maneuvers involved Japanese destroyers and a U.S. Navy carrier strike group. The report said the joint military drills were aimed at sending a warning to North Korea, which has been conducting ballistic missile tests in the region, as we've seen in the reports. And the local media outlet here in the report adds that the exercises were also meant to display joint Japan-U.S. military presence in the East China Sea, where Japan and China are locked in a long-running territorial dispute. And that's going to be a long-running theme you're going to see here with the involvement of U.S., Japan, and South Korea, as well as other nations around there like Taiwan, but mainly those three key players using North Korea as a reason to expand the whole conflict over there. But any war with North Korea is going to likely include China, which will include Russia, and of course, because it's right on their borders, and so it only makes sense, and we're going to see that even the officials are reporting on that possibility, which is certainly a major sign of the times. Meanwhile, in anticipation for a missile attack from North Korea, Japan executed its first ever civilian evacuation drill on Monday, with warnings broadcast over loudspeakers and blaring sirens and the whole deal, as this report here talks about. And it says here, Tokyo makes these preparations in response to 4 ballistic missiles launched from North Korea over a week ago, with one landing about 124 miles from the town of Oga near Japan's northwestern coast. And this is a major sign of the seriousness of the escalations there, and it only gets worse, as we're going to see in the reports here as we move along. As it was reported just a few days ago that Japan was planning to dispatch its largest warship on a 3-month tour through the South China Sea beginning in May, according to official reports. And this is its biggest show of naval force in the region since World War II, the report claims here. And we know that China claims almost all of the disputed waters, and its growing military presence over there has fueled concern not only in Japan and the West, with the United States holding regular air and naval patrols to ensure freedom of navigation over there. And so we know how much this is this area has been a focal point for quite some time, is what I'm trying to say. And so now we see Japan continuing to take new measures here with the decision to deploy their largest warship to the South China Sea on a 3-month tour in their largest show of naval force in the region since World War II. And of course, China's not happy about it, and in this piece here we see that China came out and stated, it was on Tuesday, that they are waiting for an official word on why Japan plans to send its largest warship on a 3-month tour through the South China Sea, and that it hopes Japan can be responsible. And the U.S. continues to beef up their military, and we see that here with the U.S. military moving to permanently deploy an attack drone system at an airbase over in South Korea, which could target North Korean military installations, it says here in the piece. But this is the system they're deploying is called the Gray Eagle drone system, and this was announced by the United States forces on Monday, that they would be deploying this, and that it would be stationed at the Kunsan Air Base south of Seoul. In a move analysts expect will inflame tensions between regional powers in the East and South China Seas, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang called on the National People's Congress for reinforcements to increase manpower in the waters Beijing claims are integral to the country's destiny, Chinese media reported. So again, we're seeing Chinese officials talking about an expanded military presence in the South and East China Seas. From expanded military presence to new construction on these islands, as we see here in this report, China has begun new work on disputed South China Sea islands, and it says here that China has started fresh construction work in the disputed South China Sea. New satellite images show a sign that Beijing is continuing to strengthen its military reach across the vital tradeway. Regional military attaches and experts believe the work shows China's determination to build up its network of reefs and islets, even if it's seeking to avoid a fresh confrontation with the new administration of U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned Taiwan, as China was preparing for potential war with them, and the Chinese officials spoke about the realistic possibility of this confrontation escalating to such a point. And here we see that Taiwan wants advanced arms, as it reads here in the headline of this piece, and they're producing military budget to counter the China threat. And it says here that Taiwan plans to upgrade its military with cutting-edge weapons in the face of a growing Chinese threat, the island's defense ministry said on Thursday. It has also announced a boost to its military budget. And it says here, to counter the Chinese military buildup, the Taiwanese Defense Ministry wants to upgrade its F-16 fighter jets and revamp its navy with submarines and fast attack craft. It's also seeking to acquire more surface-to-air missiles as well as cutting-edge stealth aircraft from the United States. Speaking to lawmakers in Taipei, Defense Minister Feng Shiquan also mentioned that his ministry is examining possibilities for asymmetric warfare for air and sea combat, including the use of drones. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about some of the numbers that are going to be spent. I'll link you up to it along with everything else. But just another nation seeing what's going on around them, and in the midst of, they also have claims on some of these disputed islands. And so we're seeing an increased military buildup from pretty much everybody involved in the region as tensions just continue to rise. Another aspect of what's going on here was the deployment of the U.S. THAAD missile deployment. And the United States has kicked off the deployment of this THAAD missile system in South Korea, and the move has long been opposed by Russia as well as China, but specifically by China, and China having failed to talk Seoul, South Korea, into rejecting the deployment. China has now resorted to economic counteractions, and so there's now trade war and economic warfare being implemented as what is the case usually when, prior to conflict breaking out throughout the course of history. Continuing on the U.S. THAAD system being deployed in South Korea, here we see that Moscow has come out and they've warned that the deployment of this in South Korea may start a regional arms race, and I think that's safe to say has already begun. And in the wake of Washington's controversial move to install what is called the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile Defense System in South Korea, a recent op-ed in the Global Times argues that China has little choice but to respond by increasing its nuclear arsenal. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about that in the report here, but basically they're warning that the deployment of this U.S. THAAD missile system can result in the Chinese developing nuclear weapons. And I'm almost certain that they have already begun such measures, but I'm no expert and I don't know for sure, but you'd think that would be the case. Meanwhile, the South China Morning Post cited the People's Liberation Army Air Force aviation expert Fu Qinshao saying that Beijing would send planes near the THAAD missile defense system to obstruct the system's long-range radar signals. As the war of words and saber rattling continues here. This is a piece that came out earlier today in which China has once again emphasized its strong opposition to the deployment of a U.S. Missile system on the Korean Peninsula, and they've urged all relevant parties to stop immediately. And it says here, China has clearly expressed its stance of opposition to the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Missile System deployment many times, said spokeswoman of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hua Chunying, in a regular press briefing that she did on Friday. And so this piece goes on to talk a little bit more about that, but China is urging all relevant parties involved with the deployment of this system, basically U.S. and South Korea, to stop immediately. And more here on the THAAD missile system, as this piece talks about how it brings with it the potential for military escalation and even global warfare. When you're talking about major nations like the U.S., South Korea, and Japan on one side, and then potentially North Korea, and then this war could drag in Russia and China just because of where it's located and because of everything that's going on down in the East and South China Seas. You're talking about, some of the world's major powers there, and could certainly be a trigger for something like World War III. And this piece here, which I'll link you up with, talks a lot about the facts involved and makes the case for this. In this next piece here, a former CIA official made an alarming statement about North Korea's ability to strike the U.S. with a ballistic missile. Bruce Klingner, a former CIA deputy division chief for Korea, said the isolated nation is closer than people realize to developing a nuclear missile that could cross the ocean and strike the United States, saying that this capability could be available to them in the next few years if it isn't already. Meanwhile, Pyongyang says they will not stop efforts to improve their preemptive nuclear strike capability if the United States and its allies continue conducting military exercises near the North Korean border. North Korea's ambassador to the United Nations, Kim In-ryong, told reporters on Monday. Now, in this next piece here, from the Yonhap News, which is a Chinese news Japanese news agency, I believe, it says the U.S. Special Operations Forces will take part in the joint military drills in South Korea to practice incapacitating North Korean leadership in the case of conflict, a military official said in a statement on Monday. Goes on to say that the U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 will join the annual Full Eagle and Key Resolve exercises between the two allies for the first time, along with the Army's Rangers, Delta Force, and Green Berets. And it says here a bigger number of and more diverse U.S. Special Operation Forces will take part in this year's Full Eagle Key Resolve exercises to practice missions to infiltrate into the North, remove the North's war command, and demolition of its key military facilities, the official told the Yonhap News Agency. And so that's another piece that I'll link you guys up with. So on the heels of all that, now North Korea comes out and warns again, and this time they say they're warning of merciless strikes as the U.S. Carrier joins the South Korea war drills. And it mentions here, North Korea warned the United States on Tuesday of merciless attacks if an aircraft carrier strike group led by the USS Carl Vinson, which is joining the South Korean forces for exercises, infringes on its sovereignty or dignity. And speaking of the USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier, it made a port call in South Korea on Wednesday amid warnings from the military leaders of North Korea that their upcoming joint war games may be disrupted by a strike from North Korea. And here's a piece talking specifically about an underlying theme in all of this, despite all the secondary aspects, if you want to call them that. There's a bigger picture where this could all culminate to, and this piece talks a little bit about that. As the headline reads, all-out war is on the table as the U.S. considers first strike attack against North Korea, and it looks deep and in-depth at the facts and poses the question, would China and Russia be dragged in? And we know that I've heard United States officials, Trump, Tillerson, they've all come out and said that all options are on the table and called North Korea a priority. And military action against North Korea wouldn't be pretty. Some number of civilians in South Korea, possibly Japan, and U.S. forces stationed in the Pacific would likely die in the undertaking, no matter how smoothly things went in such a war. But talk about an understatement. A U.S. first strike attack on North Korea, it says here, would likely escalate quickly into a full-bore war that would consume the entire Korean peninsula. And China and even Russia both have borders with North Korea, and specifically right in that area, could easily be dragged into such a war as this piece here goes on to talk about. Another report here talking about how the growing U.S. presence off the Korean peninsula, which includes drone stations, military drills, and even elite American special forces, is reportedly part of a plan aimed at incapacitating the rogue regime in Pyongyang should conflict break out. And so we see that reported here once again. Another article here, this one from globalresearch.ca, talking about how Washington has basically rejected diplomacy with North Korea, and it looks at some facts and again looks at whether or not Trump is contemplating a Korean War 2.0, and the signs would certainly suggest that's a very realistic possibility with everything going on. As we see in this report as well, we see that a U.S.-led war against North Korea would affect the entire Asia-Pacific region, and it seems as if that's the whole objective here, is that North Korea can be used as a means to build up the strategic military positioning that they've already started in the Asia-Pacific, specifically in the East and South China Seas, and build it up even further than they might be able to get away with otherwise. So now they create it's problem, reaction, solution. They create a problem that allows them to have a reaction that brings in the solution that actually furthers their agenda. Meanwhile, speaking of a U.S.-led war against North Korea, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said Thursday that cooperation with allies, Japan and South Korea, is critical to addressing the threat from North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. And Tillerson was speaking as he met with Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida on his first trip to Asia as the top U.S. diplomat. And the escalating threat from North Korea's nuclear program shows a clear need for a new approach, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said on Thursday, although he did not say what the Trump administration had planned, as this piece talks about. Also on Thursday, so yesterday, North Korea denounced the U.S. and South Korea for conducting the joint military drills once again near the divided peninsula using the USS Carl Vinson and USS B-52 strategic bombers, accusing the two nations of escalating nuclear attack threats against Pyongyang. Then Tillerson, today, it was released earlier that he issued the Trump administration's starkest warning yet to North Korea, saying that a military response would be on the table if Pyongyang took action to threaten South Korea and U.S. forces. Speaking in Seoul after visiting the demilitarized zone dividing the Korean peninsula and some of the 28,500 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, Tillerson said former President Barack Obama's policy of strategic patience towards Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs was over. So again, we're seeing this consistent escalation, more and more talk of nuclear attack and missile strikes and first strikes, preemptive strikes from both sides. So the saber rattling continues and the war rhetoric goes on here as on the heels of the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's arrival over in South Korea. Apparently, the Pentagon is seeing evidence that a Chinese aircraft carrier is making preparations to get underway days before the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is set to arrive in Beijing. And so we see that now this Chinese aircraft carrier is preparing to set sail ahead of the Tillerson arrival, according to U.S. officials, and will be sailing through, apparently, the East and South China Sea regions. Tillerson also apparently refused to rule out the nuclearization of Asian allies to keep North Korea in check. And just earlier in the video, I showed you how he talked about the importance of the involvement and strengthening of ties between their Asian allies, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. And now we're seeing that he's basically stating that they're willing to nuclearize them, and in a move that certainly increases the possibilities of nuclear war and is certainly symbolic of the ongoing worldwide nuclear arms race by major world powers, most notably Russia, U.S., China, and I'm sure the list goes on. But here we see that Tillerson said in an exclusive interview with Fox News, and as he refused to rule out increased weaponization and even nuclearization of America's East Asian allies to deter North Korean aggression. Then, as if there wasn't already enough rhetoric being tossed around, war rhetoric and saber rattling, Donald Trump has come out and stated that North Korea was behaving very badly and stressed that China has done little to help. And I believe all of this is really focused against China, North Korea, and Russia. When you look at what's going on a global scale. And I talk a lot about the strategic military positioning worldwide in a lot of these videos, and it's certainly a sign of the times. Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom. These are some of the signs of the times that Jesus said would precede his second coming, and we're seeing these signs at unprecedented levels, like never before in history. And I've shown you before in videos that the world as a whole is now spending more on military than ever before at any point in world history, even including both world wars and the Cold War. So that's certainly symbolic of the signs of the times. But U.S. President Donald Trump said today that North Korea is behaving very badly and China has done little to help, hours after Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that a U.S. policy of strategic patience with North Korea had ended and was over. If you remember, we looked at that. And as we see here, this U.S. policy toward North Korea has the potential to trigger catastrophic consequences, according to a Russian MP. As it says here, the consequences of unilateral U.S. actions toward a well-established nuclear power, he called North Korea. He says the nuclear power that North Korea is could be catastrophic. Konstantin Kosachev, the head of a Russian parliamentary committee on international affairs, said earlier today. So we're seeing the escalation here, my friends, and I'll end with this piece here, and of course I'll include the links in the description box below of everything I showed you, but certainly signs of the times, more wars and rumors of wars, some of the key nations involved in end-time Bible prophecy once again. I just pray that you've repented of your sins, that you've given your life to Jesus Christ and put your faith in Him and been born again by the Holy Spirit of the Almighty Creator God through your faith in Jesus. And because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, as I always say. We can look at all these signs of the times, but if that's all you're doing is seeing these signs and not understanding what they're pointing towards, you're missing the boat. Because the whole reason I do this is to point people to Jesus Christ, and which is the only way that the salvation of the soul can be had. And once you truly understand what Jesus did on that cross for your soul and the implications it has, it will change your life forever, or at least it should. But many people reject and deny, as we see. Because Jesus said, "Few there be that find it." And as times continue to get crazier, as the world continues to decay and unravel around us, and times move on, it's going to be more and more imperative. In fact, it's never more imperative than right now. The Bible says today is the day of salvation. And I pray that you'll seek Jesus with all your heart today if you haven't already, because He says if you do that, you will find Him. This is Brother Joey signing off once again for another Signs of the Times report. God bless you guys. Landlocked People's Liberation Army by 300,000 soldiers. They did all these other expansions, and including, it says here, the military buildup will also increase its Navy as much as 15% from its current 235,000 personnel, and add military bases that house multiple aircraft carrier battle groups, more nuclear-powered attack submarines, destroyers, and more sea-based missile defense platforms, according to experts. And China is boosting its military capabilities, troop numbers, and design, and its reach to defend its maritime rights, to protect its assets in the China Seas. And that's what we talk about a lot, the East and South China Seas. Specific Friday, well, a couple weeks ago now, in Beijing. And he said, it sounds as if Japan and the United States are purposely taking China as their enemy and saying, let's join hands and go at China. So we're seeing more of this rhetoric, if you will. And, just recently it was reported that China is dramatically increasing their military capabilities. And this comes off of a major overhaul that just happened last year that I did a video on. And it's happening again. And so we'll look at that here in this next piece, in which the headline reads, China next U.S. threat, as Beijing beefs up military to protect trade. And in the piece, it talks about here, it says, China is dramatically on that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24. And so I'm going to link you up as usual with everything I show you. I mean, upwards of 20 relevant articles here that we're going to go through very quickly. And of course, I'll link you up to them in the description box below. So we'll start with this one. It's talking about how Washington and Tokyo are deliberately portraying Beijing as an enemy to strengthen their security alliance, according to China's ambassador to Japan and the statements that he released. And he expressed dissatisfaction with their Cold War mindset, as he called it, and their latest attempts to contain China's regional ambitions. And the ambassador, Chung Yanghua, said faltering its military operations, creating specialized teams that can protect its maritime resources, routes, and territorial expansion plans. China will boost its Marine Corps fivefold from 20,000 to 100,000 soldiers, basing them in part at ports in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, and Gwadar in southwest Pakistan. Now, where they're stationed in Africa, I'll link you up to a piece that talks about they're stationed basically right near a massive U.S. base. And it's interesting with everything going on between the two nations as tensions continue to rise here between these major world powers. And so it goes on to say here that while they reduce the Greetings, my friends. Brother Joey here once again for another Signs of the Times report. And in this report, I want to do an Asia-Pacific update. We're going to talk about the whole North Korean situation that is apparently spiraling out of control very, very quickly in an already tense region. You know, I talk about the Asia-Pacific a lot, specifically down in the East and South China Seas. We're going to talk about what's going on down there as well, as a lot of it is tied together, as we'll see, and certainly more signs of the times as the Word of God continues to unfold and the signs continue to unfold here. The wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom.